Right, what's happening in Venezuela then? As someone's already pointed out, that Venezuela's suddenly come back into the headlines in the last couple of months, and seldom a day goes by really without a news report of some confrontation in Caracas or one of the other towns. Clearly Venezuela is in a major economic crisis and also a severe political crisis. And yet, only a matter of a couple of years ago, for socialists, Venezuela was a country that people looked to as an example of progress, welfare measures that were, at least to a certain degree, managing to eat into the inequality of Venezuela, make it a more equal society. And it was also a society in which Venezuelan workers of all sorts, in the town and the countryside, the barrios and the formal workers and so on, were seen to be taking part in a political process that was progressive. There was genuine participation of working class people in making their own history, if you like. And yet we now seem to have come to this insurmountable crisis. So what I want to do, first of all, is to kind of make clear, especially, where we stand on the situation in Venezuela at the moment, and then try and explain how it is that it's come to this, that the apparent change between the Chavez government of only a few years ago and the crisis of the Maduro government has come about. So if you take your cue from the British papers, there is only one thing that matters in Venezuela, and that is whether Jeremy Corbyn should apologise for his previous support of the Chavez government. Now, this has been the issue as far as the British press is concerned, and of course it's a completely marginal issue to what I'm going to talk about tonight. People say that Corbyn expressed support for the Venezuelan revolution. I just want to state at the very beginning that we tend not to use that term, because we prefer the term, in Spanish, the proceso bolivariano, which means the Bolivarian process. In other words, the whole political development over the last nearly 20 years. What we don't believe is there was a social revolution in Venezuela. I'll come back to that point later. But nonetheless, Corbyn has expressed support for Chavez, and of course the press has had a go at him about it, really. The reason is very simple. One is that anything will do to have a go at Jeremy Corbyn, and this is just the latest stick to beat him with, if you like. And the other is, I think, that the attack on Venezuela and Chavismo, the Chavez government and Maduro's government, is about asserting that it is not possible to challenge capitalism, and that anybody who does, or any process that does, ends in failure, crisis, violence, whatever. So it's a political message both about Corbyn and about the possibility, if you like, of radical change, and the press want to attack that, and that's why they're doing it. Now, what Corbyn has done is some things right, for a start. Corbyn has said that under Chavez there was enormous social progress made, and that is undoubtedly true. He's also pointed to some of the problems in the Venezuelan economy, which I'll come onto again in a minute, particularly the fact that they are so dependent upon oil, which again is true. And I'm sorry to say he's condemned violence on both sides, which certainly in the light of the United States last weekend is an unfortunate formulation, although Corbyn did get there first. So I want to make clear where we stand first of all, really, and it's very simple. As far as we're concerned in the SWP, there is no question that we are on the side of the Venezuelan people who have fought for longer than Chavez to resist neoliberalism, not only in Venezuela, by the way, in the whole of Latin America, and to stand up for themselves, to demand a place in making their own history, to demand a more just and equal society. There was a wave of struggle by working people in all kinds of aspects of Venezuelan life. From 1979 onwards, 1979 is a kind of milepost in Venezuelan history called the Caracazo, which means the uprising in Caracas. And it was the first of a wave of risings against neoliberalism, against previous governments. And it resulted in the end in the election of Chavez as president of Venezuela. Now, it's important to say that Chavez reflected the struggle that was already there. The Chavez government didn't embody it, it was a reflection of what was going on around it. Now, if the question is, are we on the side of people who demand a more just and a more equal society? Are we on the side of people who say that they will not accept the crumbs from the neoliberal table, or they won't accept the subaltern position, the inferior position in society that's allocated to them, that they rebel against that? Then, of course, the answer is very, very simple. We are absolutely on the side of the Venezuelan people and the Bolivarian process, and we make absolutely no apology for saying that loudly and clearly. So let's be clear, before anything else is said about the analysis of Venezuela, and I will be critical about Chavismo, As far as we're concerned, we are on the side of the Venezuelan people. We were during Chavismo, and we always will be. Now, what follows from that is equally fairly straightforward. We are utterly opposed to the Venezuelan right and to the demonstrations, the violence, etc., that they are perpetrating at the moment. If you look at most of the television coverage, the Venezuelan right are shown as the upholders of freedom and democracy, who are on the streets for protesting against dictatorship, protesting against, impositions of authority by the government, against unconstitutional behaviour and everything like that. This is absolutely not true. The Venezuelan right are a vicious, venal, nasty minority, almost exclusively, in the case of the demonstrators, drawn from the ranks of the rich and the ruling class. And what they want to do is very straightforward. They want to roll back all the gains that were made by Venezuelan people in the last 20 years, and they want to reimpose an authoritarian ruling class which will impose on them the neoliberal order that was challenged, and will make sure very firmly and carefully that Venezuelans are put in their place. And therefore the mobilisations of the right are not about human rights or democracy. They are about reasserting the control of the ruling class and making sure that that process is not only stopped, but also that revenge is taken. And that's what it will be about. If the Venezuelan right take power, it will be a bloody and brutal process, directed against not only the high levels of the Chavista government, but against the working people of Venezuela. That's what's at stake here. Now, who are the Venezuelan right? For a start, most of those demonstrators, as I say, come from the upper class. These are the overwhelmingly white Spanish-descended families who see themselves as the rightful rulers of Venezuela. There's a kind of odd mixture when they look at themselves between money and heritage, if you like, or skin colour. So the ruling class in Venezuela is overwhelmingly light-skinned, and they do see it as their entitlement to rule a society of darker-skinned Afro-Venezuelans or indigenous people. It is a deeply racist, nasty right wing. It's backed, of course, by the richest families in Venezuela, by some of the nastiest international right-wing think tanks anywhere around the world, and also by the Colombian paramilitaries, some of the drug cartels, etc. This is a thoroughly reactionary movement. They lack any democratic credentials whatsoever. They are more than happy to participate in a military coup, and indeed most of them tried to do that already in 2002 against Chavez. And their aim is absolutely specific. There are different tactics in the different sections of the right, but the one thing they have in common is wanting to roll back the Chavista process of progress, and they want to take revenge for what happened. Therefore, it's important to say this as well, I think. We do not call, as the right do, for the overthrow of the Maduro government. Whatever the situation, however critical we may be of the process that's gone on, we do not call for the same thing as the right. Because what would happen if the Chavez government falls is it will be a victory for the most horrible forces in Venezuela, it will be a victory for imperialism, and it will be a victory for neoliberalism. And therefore we have to be absolutely clear on that. We are not for the overthrow of the Maduro government. Equally, we have to be critical about the Maduro government. Neither are we cheerleaders for any state-led or top-down reform programme. That's not what we believe socialism is about. So we do need to try and understand what's happened in Venezuela, if you like, over certainly the last 5 and maybe longer years, that's brought us to this crisis that we're in. So look, to try and sum up briefly just to give an outline, what Chavez's government did do was make a good deal of social progress in fields like literacy, education, housing, more secure employment, a better standard of living, and some attack on inequality in Venezuela. That's undoubtedly true. What it did not do was change fundamentally the class relations in society. It didn't challenge how capitalism makes its profit, what we call the process of capitalist accumulation, and it didn't change the nature of the state in Venezuela at any serious level. And if you start with that framework, I think it's easier to see how the process fits together. Now, like every other progressive government in Latin America, the situation was heavily dependent on a massive boom in commodity prices on the world market. In the case of Venezuela, this means oil, almost exclusively. 95% of Venezuela's export earnings are through oil. And as long as the money was coming in, at one point oil was $140 a barrel, it's now 38 or something like that. As long as that money was coming in, it was possible to have reform programs, redistribution if you want to call it that, and also at the same time for domestic and for international capital in Venezuela to carry on making a profit. Now with the fall in oil prices, that's no longer the case. There's a very serious economic crisis, and what's happened is the Chavista government has had to make the same political choices, and I stress they are choices, as made by other countries, other governments around the world, where they have decided on austerity politics that harms the people who staged the uprising in the first place and who benefited from their reforms, and at the same time lets off the hook the big capitalist interest in Venezuela. Now, we should also understand that redistribution in Venezuela was accompanied by an enormous level of political mobilization and political struggle. So there were three particular highlights. That when the right tried to get rid of Chavez by a coup in 2002, that was stopped first and foremost by the mobilization of the barrios. So hundreds of thousands of people came down from the slums in Caracas, surrounded the presidential palace and stopped the coup. Some of these people were armed as well, stopped the coup in its tracks. A year later, the right shut down the economy in a boss's strike or a lockout, which mostly involved the oil industry, and they were quite prepared to sacrifice the entire Venezuelan economy in order to overthrow Chavez and get back their political power. Again, that was stopped by rank-and-file oil workers and by their working-class allies. A year later, they tried to do the same thing constitutionally through a recall referendum, massive mobilizations to defend Chavez, and a huge democratic mandate for him in the referendum. At the same time as that was going on, you got the beginnings, at least, quite widespread actually, of a challenge to the nature of capitalist rule in Venezuela. So you've got all kinds of flowering of popular organisations, popular initiatives, usually at base level, which began to discuss how to take control of your own lives. So in the barrios, for example, in industry, where there was talk of workers' control, in what they call the consejos comunales, the communal councils, attempts to link up popular organisations, in Caracas and in other parts of the country, in the countryside as well. So there was an enormous kind of questioning of the whole basis of capitalism. And those organisations were genuine, popular, democratic. They were the seeds of what a socialist society looks like. Most of them were co-opted into the government system by the Chavista government. So instead of being the vibrant, kind of challenging grassroots movements that they started as, many of them were corrupted and co-opted into the system, and some of their leaders bought off. Very much they were kind of demobilised wherever possible. Chavez declared a new political party in 2006 called the PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. 6.5 million people joined it, almost overnight. It was just ludicrous. It went from nothing to 6.5 million in a matter of weeks. And yet what the PSUV has become is not an organisation in which the grassroots has control over its leadership. It's not a bottom-up organisation. It's not an area of planning and creativity and questioning. It's become a state machine modelled, I think, on the Cuban Communist Party, which is essentially a transmission belt that gives orders from the top and makes sure that people follow the dictates of the regime. Now, real change definitely did come in all the areas that I've said, but the economic crisis has put Venezuela in a very serious position, right? The first and most obvious thing, that everybody talks about, is inflation. We're in the realm of guesses here. Inflation is such in Venezuela, but to take the 2016 figures, the central bank, which almost certainly told lies, said that inflation was 254%, right? Ecoanalytica, which is a kind of independent think tank, gave the estimate much higher, 525%. Just think that through. 525% inflation is impossible to live with, basically. Maduro himself increased the minimum wage in 2016 by 454%, specifically to keep rise with inflation. So we're looking at about 500%. This year it's probably between 700% and 800%. Now what that means, obviously, for ordinary Venezuelans is basically it's hard to put food on the table. Right? The teachers' union in Venezuela has calculated that it takes 17 minimum wages to pay for the minimum basket of food needed for a family annually. 17 times the minimum wage. There are chronic shortages of goods, partly because they're not available because they're not being imported, etc., partly because the rich are hoarding them and stockpiling them, and they're going onto the black market, they're being smuggled back out again to Colombia and one thing and another. But obviously, again, this has a critical effect. Shortages are supposed to be the major worry of 80% of Venezuelans at the moment. There is an enormous amount of fraud and corruption, particularly in imported goods. And I won't go through all the examples, but there's hundreds and hundreds of them. Millions and billions of pounds have been secreted away into private bank accounts. The tragedy that comes with it is that this is not just the rich that are doing that. It's also the officials of the Chavista state governors, it's members of the PSUV who are taking a cut, doing their own deals, etc. And a large number of Chavista bureaucrats have become phenomenally rich and completely beyond the control of working class people in Venezuela. So what you've got really, Chicariola Maya, who's one of the leading commentators on Venezuela in English, describes it as a class struggle inside Chavismo. So you're getting the emergence of a new Chavista ruling class. Venezuelans have a word for it. They call it the Bolivarian bourgeoisie, the Boliburguesia. It's a well-known political term amongst everybody in Venezuela. And that's what's happened, a process where the ruling party that was supposed to be the voice of the people and of progress has in fact become the niche in which an awful lot of people can make themselves very rich and way beyond the control. Now that also includes, by the way, a very large section of the Venezuelan armed forces. You look at the stuff now, you think, why hasn't the army done something about this government? And it's a good question, and it still might happen. But the truth is that the army, large sections of the army, are completely integrated into the PSUV and the new Bolivarian ruling class. So, for example, more than half the provincial governors, half the cabinet are army officers. They control strategic parts of the economy, importing food, very, very important. Some of the most lucrative ones are in the hands of the army. They direct the newest development project in the Amazon, the Arco Minero, it's called. It's a hydrocarbons mainly project, and it's under the control of the Minister of Defence during a state of emergency. So you can see the integration of the new ruling class right across Venezuelan society. Now, Chavez talked about the state just before he died in 2013. He talked about the state and he said, look, I'll give you the quote. He said, what we need is this: the radical suppression of the logic of capital and a continuing transition to socialism. We need new forms of planning and production for the benefit of people to emerge. This requires pulverising the capitalist form of the state that's still reproducing itself through abominable old practices. So Chavez was saying this right at the end of his life. This process is not it's not an analysis that we've come up with. This is quite clear, and it was clear to Chavez himself. Now, that project of challenging the capitalist state and changing society fundamentally has absolutely not gone forward in the Maduro period. So if you look at investment, for example, what investment there has been into the economy has largely been in partnership with multinationals. So if you look at the oil sector, we're talking about Repsol, we're talking about Gazprom, we're talking about Total. The usual multinational companies are dealing with the Venezuelan government on a capitalist basis. Right? International debt is still being paid, right? While Venezuelans starve, international debt is still being paid. A new development called Arco Minero, as I was saying, is there are 150 concessions to multinational companies in that one development. Any investment in state industries has been curtailed. There's no serious long-term planning. There's been and Corbyn did point to this, no major diversification in the economy, which is absolutely crucial if you're going to be able to break the circle of where a country like Venezuela is in the world economic order. That's not happened. Agriculture has not been developed, and in some cases agricultural reform has actually gone backwards. And again, to repeat, the beneficiaries of this are the ruling class, absolutely, but they're also the new ruling class inside the PSUV. Now, is there a way out, is the key question, and it's the most difficult question. And I'll answer it in general terms, but the way to deal with the crisis in Venezuela can only be one of two ways. Either it is resolved in the interests of labour, or it will be resolved in the interests of capital. It's not a situation in which the balance can continue forever. So to do it, to break out in the interests of working class people, you would have to have a completely committed intrusion into the economy. And there are lots of people inside the PSUV, the left in the PSUV, who understand this and argue for it. So they say we have to have control of foreign trade, we have to intervene in banking, we have to take over the companies that are hoarding and speculating, we have to ensure there's public investment in diversifying the economy and so on. They've got a worked out political programme. Interestingly, it's almost identical what one of the tendencies says, Marea Socialista, which is a left group inside it. It's almost identical to one offered by Michael Roberts, who people might know about the work of. He's a left-wing economist in Britain who prescribes exactly the same sort of things. And there are still loads of activists inside the PSUV and outside it who are deeply committed to changing Venezuelan society. Right? So there are, on the ground, still organisations in the barrios, in the countryside, in all kind of some sectors of industry, etc., especially among women, among Afro-Venezuelans, among young people, all kinds of initiatives at every level in the community, which are still active, still resisting. The truth is that the Venezuelan right has made gains, particularly in the December 15 parliamentary election, but the reason it's made gains is not because people are flocking to the right. It's because there's been an abstention among Chavistas. So the right gained 300,000 votes in 2015. The PSUV lost 2 million through abstentions or blank voting, or spoil voting rather. Okay? So it's not that there's been a big switch from left to right in society. What it is the pacification has become passivity. The crisis has kind of meant an ebbing away of support for the Chavez government. The majority of the Venezuelan class still rejects the right, emphatically, right? And it's written through all the stuff you read from any of the popular organisations. The right is not an alternative. And yet, equally, I don't think we can any longer take it for granted that the PSUV can command support from working people in Venezuela. The other thing, as well as an economic programme that would be needed to break out of the logjam, if you like, to break the situation in Venezuela, has got to be political mobilisation, right? There is no way out without a massive return to the kind of popular mobilisation and militancy that defended Chavez in 2003, 4, 5 and so on. That is what needs to be rekindled. And the question for the left in Venezuela, whether it's at community level or inside the PSUV, is whether they can lead the resistance in a way that does both reject the right and also take on the issues inside the PSUV. Because what will be needed is three things really. I mean, there's clearly got to be a return to mobilisation, but there's also got to be a set of serious accounting about what's gone wrong with the corruption, the inefficiency and the new ruling class. And there's got to be a wholesale clear out of those elements that have strangled the massive promise of the Bolivarian revolution and brought the situation to where it is now. Now, I'll finish very simply. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. It's a very complex process. But look, as far as we're concerned, socialism is only socialism if it comes from the workers themselves. We cannot either expect to succeed or support a top-down process that's run on capitalist lines inside the limits of the capitalist state by an elite that imposes itself on the process. Rather, as always, we look to the creativity, the militancy and the combativity of the Venezuelan working class that we've seen inside this process. We've seen what's possible. What's needed is to blow the situation open inside the PSUV and return to that creativity, that possibility of change and that vision of the future that is what inspired the Venezuelan working class, is what inspired the Chavez project and can come back in order to take on the right now.